It was 20 minutes to midnight when the lookout rang the bell 3 times, and the grandest rooms ever built at sea had 4 hours left to exist. Above the black water, the largest ship on Earth still glittered like a hotel that had wandered out into the middle of the ocean, her staircase climbing 6 floors beneath a dome of glass and iron. But the sea was already inside her, rising through those rooms, up the oak steps, past the gilded clock, and by 2 in the morning she had carried every one of them down into the dark, 2.5 miles down, where they wait even now. The question was never really why she sank. The question is which of her secret rooms the ocean chose to keep. If the great ships and the cold rooms they carried to the bottom pull at you, subscribe and stay to the end, because what the sea kept of this one is not what anyone would have chosen to save. She was not built to be the fastest thing on the ocean, only the grandest. And grandness was a thing you could sell by the room. In the first years of the 20th century, the White Star Line looked at its rival Cunard, at those 2 grey racehorses, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, tearing the speed record to pieces, and chose not to chase them. Speed was a young man's game, loud and thirsty, and quickly beaten. White Star would win the Atlantic a different way. It would build the largest ships in the world and fill them with rooms so fine that a passenger might forget the sea was there at all. The idea was simple, and it was ruinous. Comfort, not speed. A hotel that happened to float. And so she was drawn up in Belfast, in the yards of Harland and Wolff, a ship so large that the works had to raise a new tower of steel just to stand over her while she grew. When she was done, she ran 882 feet from stem to stern, near enough the height of a city tower laid down on its side. She weighed something over 46,000 tons. 29 boilers fed her furnaces, and her 4 funnels stood high enough that a tall man could have walked upright through them, though only 3 of them did any work. The 4th added purely so that she would look more powerful from the shore. Everything about her was built to be looked at and believed in. The word that followed her was one she never quite earned and never quite escaped: unsinkable. The line itself was careful, in its advertisements, never to promise the impossible outright. The claim had begun in a trade paper, a note that the cleverness of her watertight compartments made her practically unsinkable, and the crowd had simply dropped the cautious word in the middle and kept the rest. By the time she left the yard, the world had decided the thing for her. She could not sink. It was printed and repeated and believed in Belfast and Southampton and New York, by men who had built her, and men who had only read about her, until it hardened into a kind of faith. Under all of it lay the sea, which makes no promises and keeps no faith. The North Atlantic in April is a grey and patient country, and it had been swallowing ships since men first dared to cross it. It did not care how long she was. It did not care what she weighed, or what the papers called her, or how many electric lights burned along her decks. The sea had time, which is the one thing no ship has, and it had cold, and it had ice drifting down from the north in the dark. She was a marvel of her age, and her age believed that cleverness had finally beaten the ocean. The ocean had heard that before. She could carry more than 3,000 souls when she was full, crew and passengers together. And on the night that mattered, she carried something near 2,200. For all of them, she had 20 lifeboats, room in the wooden boats and the collapsible ones for perhaps 1,100 people, a little over a third of the number she could hold. No one thought this a scandal at the time. The law of the day counted boats by the tonnage of a ship and not by the heads aboard her. And besides, why crowd the beautiful boat deck with clumsy craft nobody would ever need? The boats were there to ferry survivors from a sinking ship across to a rescuing one, not to hold everyone at once. A ship that could not sink did not need lifeboats for all. The logic was perfect, and it was a trap, and it was already closing. But the boats and the boilers and the great steel bones of her were never the point. The point was upstairs, in the rooms. The way to understand how she died is to walk her the way her richest passengers did, from the top down. Step through the doors on the boat deck, out of the wind, and the ocean simply disappears. Ahead stood the forward grand staircase, and there was nothing like it afloat. It fell more than 60 feet through 6 decks of the ship, wide enough for a woman in a full gown to descend without gathering her skirts, panelled all the way in English oak carved in the manner of 3 centuries before. Above it arched a dome of wrought iron and glass, so that by day the light came down through the glass and lay along the steps, and by night a great bronze chandelier took its place. At the head of the stairs, set into the oak, was a carved panel that passengers paused to look at without quite knowing why. It showed 2 figures, and it had a name, Honour and Glory Crowning Time, and at its centre was a clock. Passengers set their watches by it. Lovers met beneath it. It kept the hours of the ship, calm and gilded and sure, counting down a number none of them could read. Remember the clock. It matters more than anything else on the staircase because of where it is now. Below the staircase, the wealth only deepened. On the upper decks lay the parlour suites, the grandest private rooms ever fitted into a ship, and the finest of those ran along the starboard side of B deck. They had 2 bedrooms and 2 dressing rooms, and a sitting room and a private bathroom, each decorated in a different style. One in the plain elegance the English called Adam, one in Italian Renaissance, one in French. The 2 best opened through their own doors onto a private stretch of promenade, 50 feet of open deck screened from the world, where a millionaire could take the air without ever standing among ordinary passengers. The cost of such a suite for the single crossing came to more than £500, a sum that in the money of today would buy a small house paid for a week at sea. Deeper still, and stranger, were the rooms most passengers never saw. There was a swimming bath filled with heated seawater, one of the first ever carried on a ship. There was a court for playing squash far down near the keel, and on F deck, buried near the bottom of her, was the thing that would matter most in the end: a Turkish bath, a suite of little rooms done in the manner of a sultan's palace, blue and green tiles on the walls, teak carved and gilded, bronze lamps hanging low, a cooling room where a passenger could lie on a carved couch after the heat and the steam and feel 2 miles above the seabed, like an emperor. Keep that room in mind as well. The sea will come back to it. Somewhere among all of this, on almost every day of the crossing, walked a quiet man from Belfast. His name was Thomas Andrews, and he had drawn these rooms. He was the ship's designer, the nephew of the man who ran the yard, and he had come along on the maiden voyage the way a father comes to a wedding, to watch the thing he had made behave in the world. He carried a notebook. He noted that there were too many screws in the stateroom hat hooks, that the reading room was painted a shade too dark. He loved her the way a man can only love a thing he has built with his own hands. He knew every room aboard, every corridor, every door. He knew, better than any soul aboard, exactly how she was built to float. Before the next night was over, he would know something else, that not one of these rooms was as safe as the world believed, and that the sea was about to walk them all from the bottom up. The thing that would empty every one of those rooms was not a gash the length of a street, but an opening a person could have covered with a dinner table. For most of the last century, the world pictured the wound as a great tear, hundreds of feet of steel ripped open like paper. The truth, when the machines finally went down to look, was quieter and worse. The iceberg did not slash her. It leaned against her, below the waterline, for about 6 seconds. And in those 6 seconds, it sprung her seams and popped her rivets along a stretch of the starboard hull, opening a run of narrow slits and buckled joints. Added together, all the holes the sea poured through came to something near 12 square feet. A wound, smaller than a doorway, spread thin along 300 feet of ship, was enough to drown the largest vessel on Earth. It was enough because of a choice made years before, in the quiet of a drawing office. She was divided along her length into 16 watertight compartments, walls of steel that could be sealed at the turn of a switch, and this was the very cleverness that had earned her the word unsinkable. She could float with any 2 of them flooded. She could float with the first 4 gone. But the walls that made the compartments carried a flaw that no passenger would ever have noticed, and that would kill most of them. They did not reach high enough. They rose only a deck or 2 above the waterline and stopped, open at the top, so that once enough of the forward compartments filled, the sea simply brimmed over the top of one wall and fell into the next, and then the next, the way water fills the sections of an ice tray tilted in the hand. The iceberg had opened her along 6 compartments. She was built to survive 4. From the moment of contact, the arithmetic was already finished, though almost no one aboard yet knew it. That was the flaw in her bones. There was a second flaw in her boats, and a third in the calm itself. The night was flat and black and starlit, without a breath of wind, and a windless sea is a beautiful and treacherous thing, for there was no swell to break white against the ice and give it away. The berg came out of the dark, almost on top of her. The 2 men in the crow's nest had no glasses to see with, the binoculars locked away, and the key carried off in the shuffle of officers at Southampton, so they watched the sea with their bare eyes. When the shape finally rose out of the night ahead, black against black, there were perhaps 30 seconds left. The order came, hard over, engines full astern, and she began to swing, slowly. The way a very large thing turns, she almost made it. That is the detail that has haunted 100 years of retelling. She very nearly cleared it. And in almost clearing it, in turning her flank away, she gave the ice her whole side to open. There had been warnings. All through that day, her wireless room had taken messages from other ships, ice ahead, a field of it, floes and bergs drifting down across the shipping lanes. Some of the warnings reached the bridge, and some did not, for the 2 young operators were buried in a backlog of passengers' messages, cheerful nonsense to friends in New York, and a ship steaming at near her top speed into a known field of ice did not slow down. Why should she? She could not sink. So she came on, lit from bow to stern, the band still playing somewhere warm, the clock on the staircase keeping its calm, gilded time, and the ice waiting in the dark ahead like a thing that had been set there on purpose. What happened in the next 2 hours and 40 minutes would send her, and most of the souls aboard, and every one of her beautiful rooms, down toward a darkness where they would lie undisturbed for 73 years. When the first robot lamp swung down through the place where the most famous staircase in the world had stood, it lit nothing at all. It was the summer of 1985, 73 years after she went down, and a joint American and French team, led by an oceanographer named Robert Ballard, had at last found her, lying broken on the floor of the North Atlantic. Just after 1 in the morning, on the 1st of September, the shape of one of her huge boilers rose out of the dark on a video screen aboard the research ship, and a room full of scientists fell silent because there was no longer any doubt. She had been found. What they found in the years of exploring that followed was not the ship the world remembered. She lay in 2 great pieces, the bow and the stern, torn apart, and flung down a third of a mile from one another, with a wide field of wreckage scattered between them across the mud. And when the small submarines and their tethered robots went down inside the bow, into the grand entrances she had been so proud of, they came to the top of the forward grand staircase and found that it was gone. Where 60 feet of carved oak had climbed toward a dome of glass, there was only a shaft, a deep and empty well falling away into blackness. The walls stripped, the steps vanished, the great clock nowhere. The proudest room on the ship was simply not there. That absence is where this story truly begins. A ship 2.5 miles down is a puzzle told in what remains and what does not, and the first and largest riddle she offered was this. If the ocean could take a staircase the size of a house and leave a bare hole, what had it done to the rest of her rooms? What had it torn out? And what, if anything, had it chosen to spare? The wreck lies at about 12,500 feet, a depth that is hard to hold in the mind, deeper than 8 of the tallest towers in Paris stacked one upon another, deep enough that the water above presses down at more than 3 tons on every square inch. No sunlight has reached her since the day she sank. The cold never lifts. It is the nearest thing to another planet that exists on this one, and somewhere in that endless dark lay whatever was left of a Turkish bath, a millionaire's promenade, a café got up to look like Paris. For years, the wreck gave up its secrets a hand's breadth at a time in the narrow beam of a submarine's lamp. A robot the size of a garden mower would creep down a corridor trailing its cable, and a screen far above would show, for a few seconds, a doorway, a fallen beam, a light fitting still hanging from its wire, and then the silt would billow up and swallow the picture. It was like trying to read a great book through a keyhole, one word at a time. Explorers gave the rooms names as they went, working out from the builder's plans where they were, matching a surviving fireplace or a run of windows to a drawing made in Belfast 3/4 of a century before. Slowly, dive by dive, a map of the drowned palace began to form. And running through all of it was the strangeness that the sea had not destroyed her evenly. Some rooms were crushed to nothing. Some were scattered across the seabed as loose debris, a wash basin here, a bedstead there, a chandelier lying in the mud with its crystals still on it. And a few, a precious few, had been sealed and held almost as they were on the last night, waiting in the dark for a light to find them. To understand why, and to learn which rooms the ocean kept, the story has to go back to the last 2 hours the ship was whole, and follow the water as it learned her floor plan by heart. The ocean did not flood her all at once. It moved through her rooms in an order, and that order is written in the evidence like a confession. The wound was forward and low, and so the sea began at the bottom of her bow and worked its way up and back, patient and unhurried, taking the ship deck by deck the way a tide takes a beach. The first room to drown was one no passenger would mourn. Deep in the bow, below the waterline, lay the mail hold, where clerks sorted the letters and parcels of 2 nations. Within minutes of the impact, the water was around the clerks' knees, then their waists, and they were hauling wet sacks up a stairway to a higher deck, trying to save the mail of strangers while the Atlantic came in behind them. Just aft of them lay the great boiler rooms, and there the men felt the cold sea burst through the side and rise around the furnaces, and the order came to draw the fires before the boilers could explode against the flood. Stokers scrambled up the escape ladders, soot black and soaked, into a night that had turned strange. Above them, at first, almost nothing seemed wrong. That is the terrible mercy of those early minutes, and the engine of the whole disaster. In the warm, bright rooms of the upper decks, the The shudder of the collision had been a small thing, a tremor in a wine glass, a faint grinding somewhere far below. A few passengers went out onto the forward well deck and found lumps of ice scattered there, kicked at them, laughed. In the smoking room, the card games went on. The staircase clock kept its calm, gilded time. The ship was already dying, and the palace did not know it. And the man who had drawn the palace was the first to understand. Thomas Andrews went down with the captain to look, and what he read in the rising water finished him. He knew the plan of her better than the sea did. He counted the flooded compartments, forward and low, 1, 2, 3, and further back. And he did the arithmetic in his head, and the arithmetic came out death. 5 compartments open, perhaps 6, and she could float with 4. He told the captain plainly. She would founder. There was no version of the night in which she did not. He gave her an hour, perhaps 2. It was somewhere near midnight, and the sea had a schedule now, and Andrews alone knew every stop on it. From there, the flooding is a clock that cannot be stopped. The bow settled, and as it settled, it dipped lower, and as it dipped, the sea reached further back and poured into rooms it could not have touched on the level. Water that had filled the forward holds began to spill up stairwells and along corridors, finding the passenger decks, finding the fine rooms one by one. It crept up through the third-class quarters in the bow. It reached the foot of a broad staircase far forward and began to climb it. And higher in the ship, near the beating heart of her grandeur, the water was coming for the great one, the forward grand staircase, the 60 feet of carved oak beneath the dome. It had not reached it yet, but it was in the corridors below, rising, and it had all night. And the staircase was made of wood. And wood, in the end, does not decide these things. The sea does. Up on the boat deck, in the cold and the strange calm, the first canvas covers were coming off the lifeboats, and there were nowhere near enough of them. By now the ship was down at the head enough to feel it underfoot, and the calm was breaking into something else. The band had come up from below and begun to play. Rockets were being made ready, and the clock at the head of the grand staircase, that gilded panel called Honor and Glory Crowning Time, kept counting, while beneath it, deck by deck, the water climbed toward the most beautiful room aboard. For 70 years the survivors argued whether she went down whole, and the wreck answered them in the cruelest possible way. In the lifeboats, drifting on the black water, hundreds of people had watched her end, and they could not agree on what they had seen. Some swore she slid under in one piece, dignified, entire. Others said she broke, that she cracked apart at the surface with a roar like nothing on earth. The 2 official inquiries, one American and one British, listened to all of it and chose to believe she had gone down in one piece. It was the gentler story, and for 3 generations it stood. The wreck settled the argument without mercy. She lies in 2 pieces because she came apart. Somewhere in her final minutes, as the bow dragged down and the stern rose black against the stars, the strain grew past what her steel could bear, and she tore herself in half between the 3rd and 4th of her funnels, near the top of the very grand staircase this story keeps returning to. The bow, heavy with water, planed away and down into the dark and drove into the mud. The stern, full of air and people, hung a moment, then went, spinning and breaking apart on the way down and landing 1/3 of a mile away as a wilderness of torn steel. Between the 2 halves, the sea is littered with the insides of her, poured out as she split. For decades, even that was known only in fragments, glimpsed through thick glass in the beam of a lamp. Then, in the summer of 2022, a survey company took a different approach. 2 robots the size of small cars, named after the lovers in the old play, spent 6 weeks flying slow, careful lines back and forth above the wreck, day and night, in the pattern a farmer uses to mow a field. They took more than 700,000 photographs and gathered 16,000 billion bytes of data, and from all of it, they built the first full picture of her ever made, an exact model of the whole wreck and the debris field around her, lit evenly and seen whole, as no diver in a submarine had ever been able to see her. For the first time, she could be looked at the way she was drawn, entire, out of the dark. And the model showed something that mattered a great deal to the rooms. The break had not been clean. She had not parted along a neat line. She had been wrenched apart with terrible violence, and the tearing had happened straight through the most expensive quarters of the ship, ripping open the first-class cabins at the after end of the bow section, folding decks down onto one another, spilling the private rooms of the rich into the sea in the very act of dying. The place where she chose to break was the place where her grandest suites had stood. The people who had paid the most for the finest rooms had, without knowing it, booked passage at the exact seam along which the ship would come undone. So the evidence lay open at last. The facts, any account of her rooms would have to fit. A bow, driven deep into the mud and holding much of its shape, its forward decks recognizable, its inner rooms sealed or scattered. A stern half a mile off, so crushed and folded that even now it is hard to tell one deck from another. A wide field of debris between them, where the loose furniture of a floating palace lies in the silt, chandeliers and washstands and wine bottles and shoes, and here and there a thing so whole it stops the breath. That was the wreck. What it had done to each named room, one at a time, is the reckoning the rest of this story is for. And the first room to answer for itself is the one that is not there, the great staircase that fell through her heart and vanished. The grandest room aboard was made almost entirely of oak, and oak, it turns out, floats. That single fact may be the reason the most famous staircase in the world is not where it should be. When the robots first descended into the forward bow and reached the place of the grand staircase, they found the great well that had held it, 6 decks deep, and they found it empty. The steps were gone. The carved balustrades were gone. The dome above had shattered inward. And the clock, the gilded panel of honor and glory crowning time, was nowhere in the beam of the lamp. There are 2 ways a room can vanish this completely, and the truth is probably a marriage of both. The first is the sinking itself. As the sea rose through the stairwell in those last minutes, the theory goes, the buoyant oak structure, light and hollow and full of trapped air, was lifted bodily off its fixings by the rising water and driven up and out through the breaking dome, like a cork forced from a bottle, to float away across the surface and come down, piece by piece, somewhere else entirely in the debris field. One man who came to know the wreck better than almost anyone, the film director who dived her again and again, believed she had been unstitched from the inside this way, the water floating her proudest room out through her broken roof. The second way is slower and sadder. For 73 years before anyone came, the wood sat in the cold, salt dark, and the sea is full of small hungers. Wood-boring creatures and the endless working of the water may simply have eaten and loosened and carried the staircase away by degrees until nothing of it was left. What the sea left behind, in place of the whole, are relics. Here and there in the ruined foyers, a light fitting still hangs from its wire. A small bronze lamp swaying in a current no eye can see, marking where a landing used to be. Down in the debris, explorers found the twisted remains of a great candelabra that had stood on one of the lower landings, lying bent in the silt with the shape of its arms still upon it. The base of a bronze cherub, one of the little winged figures that had held a lamp at the foot of the stairs, was lifted from the seabed and brought up into the light, and it sits now in a collection ashore, a fragment of a room that no longer exists, polished and staring, older than everyone who comes to look at it. The staircase that a woman in a ball gown had once descended like a queen is now a handful of pieces scattered across 2.5 miles of water. It is worth stopping on how strange this is, because it sets the pattern for everything that follows. Of all the rooms aboard, the grand staircase was the most seen, the most photographed, the most loved, the one that stood in every mind when the name of the ship was spoken. It was also the most fragile, for all its grandeur, because it was made of the wrong thing in the wrong place. A tower of dry wood set inside a ship that was about to become the ocean. The sea has no reverence. It does not keep the famous room because it is famous. It keeps what its own blind rules decide to keep, cold and buried and sealed, and it lets the rest go. The staircase broke that rule of fame in the harshest way. The room the world would most have wished to save is the one room the sea most completely erased. But the same blind rules that took the staircase spared other things, further down and further in the quarters of the very rich. And there the wreck holds a crueler irony still, because the most expensive rooms on the ship were built along the exact line where she tore in two. The most expensive rooms on the ship sat exactly where the ship chose to tear herself in half. Along the starboard side of B deck, high in the bow section, ran the parlour suites, and the finest of them all belonged for that crossing to a wealthy widow from Philadelphia named Charlotte Cardeza and her grown son Thomas. Their suite was 3 rooms and more, 2 bedrooms and 2 dressing rooms, and a sitting room done in the French taste, with a marble bathroom and a servant's passage, and beyond its own private door lay 50 feet of enclosed promenade deck, a stretch of open air that belonged to no one else aboard. For the week of the voyage, the family paid something over £512, a sum that would keep a working man and his family for years. Tens of thousands in the money of the present, spent on a set of rooms for a single crossing of the sea. Charlotte Cardeza and her son lived. When the boats were being lowered, they went down early, in one of the first away, and they were among the 700 or so who watched from the water as the lights went under. And here, the wreck delivers one of its coldest ironies. The woman survived, and her rooms did not. The suite she stepped out of that night lay directly along the line where the ship tore herself apart, and when the great scan of 2022 was built, it showed the after end of the bow section wrenched open and folded down, the first-class cabins along that seam ripped apart in the act of breaking, spilled into the dark. The rooms that had cost more than any others aboard were among the first to be destroyed, torn open at the very moment of the ship's death and emptied into the sea. Something of those rooms survives, though, in a way stranger than any wreck photograph, because Charlotte Cardeza was a careful woman. After the disaster, she made a claim against the line for everything she had lost, and she wrote it all down, item by item. A list so long and so exact that it has become one of the great inventories of the vanished ship. Line after line of it, the gowns and the furs and the jewels, the ostrich feathers, the lace, a single pink diamond, the sums running to a small fortune, more than $170,000 in the money of 1912. It is a photograph of a room taken in words, a record of exactly what the sea swallowed when it tore open her suite, written by the one person who had slept in it and lived. Read it now, and the room reassembles for a moment in the mind, warm and cluttered and rich, and then the wreck takes it away again. Not far along in the story, though not in the ship, was the richest man aboard, a colonel named John Jacob Astor, travelling with his young wife on sea deck. He did not survive. He put her into a boat, asked whether he might join her because of her condition, was told no, stepped back, and was gone. His wife lived. It is the same pattern again and again in the fine rooms of the bow, the women stepping down into the boats and living, the rooms, and often the men they left behind going down into the dark. Who lived and who died aboard her mapped almost exactly onto who they were, first class or third, woman or man, and nowhere was the gap wider than here, among the suites, where nearly every woman was saved and their beautiful rooms were annihilated beneath them. So the grandest private rooms of the ship are gone, torn along the seam of the break, remembered now only in a widow's list and a folded ruin of steel 2.5 miles down. But go down another deck and another, away from the suites and toward the waterline, into the public rooms where the whole of first class gathered to dine and drink and be seen. And the wreck begins at last to keep a little more of what it took. There, in the mud, a goddess was waiting. In 2024, a robot found a bronze goddess lying face up in the silt, exactly where a palace room used to be. She was a small statue, about 2 feet tall, a figure of the huntress Diana in the old Roman style, and in life she had stood as the centerpiece of the first-class lounge, one of the most beautiful rooms on the ship. The lounge had been built in the manner of a palace outside Paris, all carved paneling and gilt and deep chairs, a place where ladies took tea beneath a moulded ceiling while the ship carried them across the sea. When the room came apart, the little goddess fell out of it and down into the debris field, and there she lay for more than a century, until a passing robot's lamp found her whole and unbroken, staring up out of the mud at a light from the world she left. A goddess in a room that no longer has any walls. The lounge was one of a cluster of grand public rooms in the afterpart of the ship, and each was a small marvel. There was a reading and writing room, pale and quiet, meant for the ladies. There was a smoking room for the men, panelled in dark mahogany inlaid with mother of pearl, with a great painting above the fireplace of a ship coming into harbour. And there were the 2 rooms where first class dined at its finest, a restaurant run as a business within the ship by an Italian named Gatti, all French walnut and crystal, and beside it a café got up to look like a pavement in Paris, with real ivy trained along white trellises and wicker chairs, and windows open to the sea air. In these rooms, on the last calm evenings, the wealthy of 2 continents ate and laughed and dressed for dinner, waited on hand and foot, while far below them the furnaces roared and the ice drew nearer. And here the story turns very dark, because those beautiful rooms had a hidden cost that the wreck does not show, but the record does. The men who made the finest meals on the ship, the cooks and waiters of the Italian restaurant, were not part of the ship's regular crew. They were Gatti's own people, brought aboard as a private staff, and they were housed low in the ship, aft and deep, in quarters near the waterline. When the end came, they were, by most accounts, held below and forgotten in the chaos, behind gates and down passages, while the passengers they had served went up to the boats. Of roughly 60 of them, almost none survived. The people who built the glamour of those rooms drowned in the dark beneath them, while many of the diners they had served that very night stepped into the boats and lived. It is the cruelest arithmetic on the whole ship. The rooms lived on forever, in photographs and paintings and film, famous and beautiful and endlessly retold. The men who made them beautiful have hardly a name among them. So the great public rooms are a mixed grave. The lounge is broken and scattered, but it gave up its goddess whole. The smoking room and the restaurant are ruins, guessed at from a surviving window frame or a run of tile. The café is gone, and the debris field between the two halves of the ship is thick with the small furniture of all of them: a wine bottle standing upright in the silt, a serving dish, a chandelier lying on its side with the crystals still catching the light. The sea took the diner's rooms and left their broken pieces lying about like a table cleared by a careless hand. But there was one room the sea did not clear. One room, buried deeper in her than almost any other, so far down and so quickly drowned that when a light finally reached it, more than 90 years after the sinking, it was found not broken, not scattered, but nearly whole, its tiles on the walls and its couches in their places, waiting in the dark as though the last bather had only just stepped out. Of all the rooms she carried down, this is the one the ocean chose to keep. Of all the rooms she took down, the ocean chose to preserve the one almost no one thinks of, a bathhouse buried deep in her belly. Far down on F deck, near the bottom of the ship, the White Star Line had built a Turkish bath, a suite of little rooms in the fashion of a sultan's palace, and its heart was the cooling room, where a passenger came to rest after the heat and the steam. It was a small and secret marvel, done in an exotic style found nowhere else aboard. The walls were faced in glazed tiles of blue and green. The woodwork was teak, carved and gilded. Low bronze lamps hung on chains, and against one wall a marble fountain gave cold drinking water, and around the room stood carved couches with cushions where a bather could lie and cool and dream, deep inside the largest ship in the world. In 2005, a team exploring the wreck sent a robot creeping down into the drowned lower decks of the Bull, into the buried belly of her, and there, in the beam of the lamp, the cooling room came slowly out of the dark, and the explorers went quiet. It was there, not scattered, not crushed, but held. The green and blue tiles still ran along the walls. The carved teak of the little dressing cubicles still stood. The bronze fittings still hung in their places. Even the couches, the recliners where passengers had lain a century before, were recognizable, softened and draped in the pale hanging rust. The wreck grows like moss, but unmistakably there. Of all the beautiful rooms she had carried to the bottom, this hidden bathhouse, which few of her passengers ever even saw, was the most whole thing left inside her. The reason it survived is the reason so much else did not, turned on its head. The cooling room was doomed early and saved by it. Buried low and forward in the ship, it filled with water almost at the beginning of the sinking, gently and completely, long before the violence came. By the time the ship broke and the bow began its long fall to the seabed, the room was already full, the pressure inside it matching the pressure without, so that when the bow struck the mud with force enough to bury it deep, the cooling room, cushioned by the water already inside and shielded by all the steel around it, was spared the crushing that flattened the exposed upper decks. The very thing that made it a death trap on the night, its depth and its early flooding, is what made it a time vault in the century after. The sea drowned it first and kept it best. And there is the strangeness this whole story has been circling, laid bare at last. The ship carried rooms of every kind down into the dark, the proud and the private and the plain, and the ocean did not choose among them by any measure a human heart would recognize. It did not keep the grand staircase, the room the world loved most, the room that stood in every mind. It scattered the millionaire suites and swallowed the lounge and cleared the great dining rooms. And then, far below all of them, it reached out and closed its hand gently around a windowless bathhouse that hardly anyone remembers, and it held that one nearly perfect for 100 years and more. The sea keeps what its own blind rules keep, the buried and the early drowned and the sealed. and it lets the famous and the fragile go. There is no justice in it, and no cruelty either. There is only the cold arithmetic of water and steel and depth, indifferent as the dark itself. That indifference is the truth this ship was built to deny, and the last thing left to do is to go back, one final time, to the night the arithmetic ran, and stand inside the rooms as the sea came up through them and took them, deck by deck, toward the place where they have lain ever since. Now put the people back into the rooms on the last night, and let the water do what the evidence says it did. It is a little after midnight. The ship is down at the head, and the tilt of the floor is unmistakable now, and the calm is going out of the great rooms like warmth out of a body. In the first-class corridors, stewards knock on doors, calling passengers up in their lifebelts. On the boat deck, the crew swings out the boats, and the first of them are lowered half-empty into the black, because no one truly believes yet that this bright, warm palace is going to die. Down through the ship, the sea keeps its schedule. By midnight, the water is in the squash court far below, where a passenger had booked a game for the morning. By 1 a.m, it has climbed high into the bow, and the forward staircases are filling. And near the centre of her, the great grand staircase, 60 feet of oak beneath its dome, begins at last to drown. Watch it happen, because it is the withheld horror of this whole story arriving. The sea comes up the lowest steps first, cold and black and quiet, and climbs. It rises past the carved panelling. It rises toward the landing where the gilded clock keeps its calm time. Honour and glory crowning time. Still counting, still lit, as the water reaches for it. Somewhere on the staircase the band has been playing, and the music carries up the well as the sea climbs it until the two meet. The most beautiful room on the ship fills from the bottom up, in the dark, with the lights still burning under the water, and the clock goes under mid-stroke, drowned at some hour it never finished telling. And in the smoking room, one deck up and aft, a man stands alone. The stories say it was Thomas Andrews, the man who drew every room now dying around him. They say he stood before the great painting of a ship coming into harbour, his lifebelt off and lying on a table, staring at the wall, past speech, past hope. A designer alone in the finest of his rooms as it tilted toward the sea. No one can prove it was so. It is the tenderest of the legends the ship left behind, and it endures because it is the right ending for him, the maker going down inside the thing he made, in a room he had drawn with his own hand. At about 2:15, the lights, which have burned without a flicker through all of it, blaze once and turn red and die, and the ship goes black. And now the arithmetic finishes. The bow, full of the sea, drags her down by the head until the stern lifts clear of the water, higher and higher, and the strain runs through her like a scream. And between the third and fourth funnels, near the top of the drowned staircase, she tears in too. The bow falls away into the dark. The stern crashes back, floats a moment full of people, then rises again, and goes. At 2:20 in the morning, 2 hours and 40 minutes after a wall of ice brushed her side for 6 seconds, the largest ship in the world is gone from the surface of the sea, and more than 1,500 people are in water so cold it stops the heart in minutes. Below them, unseen, the rooms are falling. The bow planes down through 2.5 miles of black water and drives into the mud. The stern spins and comes apart as it goes, raining the insides of a palace across the seabed. The grand staircase, floated free or breaking apart, scatters into the dark. The suites tear open along the seam. The lounge spills its goddess into the silt, and far down in the belly of the sinking bow, Sealed and already full, the little cooling room with its blue and green tiles begins its slow, whole, 100-year rest on the floor of the ocean. By the time the rescuers come, hours later, there will be nothing on the surface but boats and bodies and a scatter of wreckage, and everything that mattered will already be on its way to the bottom. The rooms she took are being taken a second time, slowly, by rust and by something alive. The wreck is not a stone monument holding its shape in the cold. It is dissolving. Across the whole of her, hanging from every rail and beam, grow long draperies of orange decay the explorers call rusticles, and they are not simply rust. They are the work of living things, colonies of tiny creatures that eat the iron of the ship and leave those hanging icicles behind. And between them, they are said to consume hundreds of pounds of her every day. She is being eaten, slowly, patiently, the way the sea does everything. She is being unmade and carried off a grain at a time into the water. The proof of it lies in how much has gone in a single lifetime of watching. When the wreck was first explored, an iron railing still ran along the very tip of her bow, the rail where, in the world's imagination, a passenger might have stood to feel the wind. As late as the year 2010, it was still there, standing as it had stood on the night she sailed. When the robots came back in 2024, they found a long section of that railing broken away and lying flat on the seabed below, fallen sometime in the years between. Elsewhere, the roof of her officers' quarters has caved inward. A whole deck house has folded down. The crow's nest, from which two men watched for ice with their bare eyes, rotted away and vanished long ago. Those who study her now believe the recognizable ship has only decades left, that within the lifetime of a child born today, the hull will lose its shape entirely and slump into a stain of rust and fittings on the ocean floor, and the rooms will pass out of reach forever. Which means something plain and hard to sit with. This is the last generation that will be able to look upon her rooms at all. The staircase is already gone to an empty well. The suites are torn and folding. The lounge is scattered, though it gave up its goddess. And even the one room the sea chose to keep, the little tiled cooling room deep in her belly, will in time be crushed as the decks above it fall, and the last whole room aboard the Titanic will close for good. The ocean kept its catalogue for 100 years, and now, unhurried as ever, it has begun to close the book. Go back, at the very end, to the head of the grand staircase, on a calm, bright evening before any of it, and stand where the passengers stood. The oak glows, the chandelier burns, and set into the panelling is the carved clock, the two figures and the gilded face, honor and glory crowning time, keeping the hours of the ship sure and serene. That clock is at the bottom of the ocean now, floated away or eaten to nothing, in a stairwell that is only a hole in the dark. It kept perfect time to the very end, and the hour it was counting toward was the ship's own. Everything around it had been built to say that this could not happen, that cleverness and steel and money had at last put an end to the old terror of the sea. 6 years before she sailed, the man who would command her stood on the deck of another great liner and told a reporter exactly what his age believed. "I cannot imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder," he said. "I cannot conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." He went down with the Titanic on a windless night in the spring of 1912, and the rooms he trusted went down with him, and the sea he could not imagine defeating him took them all, and has been quietly finishing the work ever since. Somewhere in the dark down there, a man from Belfast is still standing in the finest room he ever drew, and somewhere below him, holding for just a little longer, A small tiled room keeps its shape against the weight of 2.5 miles of water, the last of the secret rooms, waiting for the sea to make up its mind. If these drowned rooms stayed with you, then subscribe, because another great ship and another last night are always waiting to be told. And tell me below, if you could go down and stand in just one of her rooms before the sea finishes taking them, which room would you choose, and who would you hope to find still waiting in it? I read every reply,